I'm a huge Wild Labs fan, so really delighted to be invited to be here today. So I am a very recently new assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara in California. And I thought I'd just chat about a couple of projects that I'm working on that leverage conservation technology in what I am hoping are some exciting ways. So my primary research interest is really trying to understand the many ways that humans impact wildlife. And I personally think that, this huge constellation of biodiversity sensing technologies that we have are really critical to understanding this. So in my research, I try and leverage just about all of these at various points. I got my start in working with bioacoustics, which is still very close to my heart. So it's really fun to see that supported at Wild Labs. I just think, I'm really interested in thinking about how these different types of data can come together to help us understand these connections. So the first project I wanted to chat about was really motivated by recent devastating events that our planet went through. I don't know if you all recall in the very early days of the pandemic, seeing all sorts of photos like this popping up in popular news media, where, we saw a lot of reports of, as we were all staying home, that wildlife were literally taking back to the streets. And so I think for, many of us, this seemed like a potential silver lining in some very dark times, but also brought up a lot of really interesting questions about, what our relationship with wildlife is, and if this sort of massive change in human activity could be a way to understand that in a more nuanced way. So I launched a initiative along with many other folks that's housed under the umbrella of the International Biologging Society to try and understand, we sort of pitched this as a way to understand how wildlife interact with humans, and particularly focusing on using GPS data and animal movement trajectories as a fundamental sort of like data type that we were all oriented around. And so if you're interested in being involved, I can share more information on that, but we have lots of folks donated movement data for us. And then now we have many sub-projects underneath this where folks are sort of picking off the specific pieces that they find interesting. And it's been a really wonderful collaborative community to be involved in. So I wanted to highlight the project that I've been leading along with many other folks, just specifically focused in the US. So we really wanted to link movement trajectories of animals to high resolution data on human mobility, and trying to understand the sort of relative impacts of landscape modification versus the impact of our actual direct presence has on humans, which in general gets sort of, lost from the picture. I think we usually conflate these two. And I think they're, like we saw in the pandemic, there's some interesting places where animals without us are able to utilize habitats and vice versa. So we're leveraging movement data across the US for birds and mammals to try and disentangle these. And so I'll just show a few results. So we're specifically looking at the impacts on space use, so the amount of area that animals use on a weekly basis, and then also how that translates into the environmental niches that they use, so the environmental conditions that they're accessing. And so for a single species, we're able to look at the relative impacts of modification and mobility. So in the case of the cougar, we can see that there's actually two things going on, right? That it's not just that they use less space in more highly modified environments, it's that they also use less space when we're around, which is pretty interesting. But then we also see this interactive effect where the impact of modification or of our presence is actually stronger in less modified environments. So that's, maybe pointing to cases where, us showing up in public parks or big national parks has a bigger effect than it would in a city where, potentially individuals are more habituated to our presence. And then we can also show how that translates into the types of resources they're using. So then we repeated this across a lot of about 40 different species of birds and mammals across the US. And this is work that we're hoping to submit fairly soon with a number of other co-authors. But what's really striking to us is just the really heterogeneous responses that we see across species. And I won't, in 10 minutes can't dig into all the nuances here, but what we're really interested in is then bringing these into typologies of responses that we see for species and really thinking about, why some species might show some responses versus others. So we see some that simply change the amount of space they use. We see some where we think they may actually switch the locations that they use. Where others where we actually see that they have to switch locations and then change the resources that they use in order to sort of accommodate our presence. And so this work to me has been really exciting to think about how we can actually bring in new technologies that understand actually human impacts and how important that is, and somewhat unrecognized in the conservation tech space. So then zooming back out, so that's just one piece, I think, where movement data can bring a lot of rich information. But I'm really interested in general in thinking about biodiversity data as a whole and what the gaps are and how technology can play a role in filling our knowledge gaps. So I've been doing a lot of work looking at this at the global scale. So I led this study, thinking about, we often see, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, is this huge data aggregator that's been really powerful in promoting data sharing and access across the world. So on the left, we're looking at the annual number of species records collected for terrestrial vertebrates, and it's just truly staggering that we're seeing, hundreds of millions of records being collected per year on bird species globally. But then I was really interested in thinking about, okay, but how does that translate into information about these species? And so all the way over on the right is a metric I developed that is, at the simplest, really quantifying for a species and its range, what proportion of the range had records per year. And so when we look at that metric averaged across species, it's actually much lower. So even for the most highly documented groups like birds, we're seeing less than 20% of species ranges sampled per year. And so to me, that speaks to this huge gap in our ability to really understand what's going on as we think about things like climate change and potential range shifts. But we also see this scaling up so if we look at this nationally, it's not probably surprising to any of us, but we really do see, even with the tremendous amount of data being collected, these huge geographic biases in our knowledge of biodiversity, and obviously has just huge, tremendous impacts as we try and move forward with a lot of the sort of international targets on biodiversity conservation. And one thing I'm particularly excited about is, we see these big frameworks come out of like the Conservation Convention on Biological Diversity, which are holding countries accountable to collecting data and the role that technology, we need to automate some of this process in order to fill these gaps. And so I've been collaborating with the Wildlife Insights Initiative, which I'm sure many of you may have heard of before, but very briefly is a large collaboration across a number of NGOs as well as Google to try and create a platform for camera traps to begin with, where folks can upload their camera trapping data and receive species level ID supported by Google AI. And then the sort of incentive structure is that hopefully this promotes data sharing and allows people to more rapidly process their camera trapping imagery into some of the key analytics they might want. So I've been working with another researcher, Fabiola Iannarilli at Yale, to look at, so repeating this exercise that I did with GBIF data, but then adding in the, Wildlife Insights is still in its early days, but we have a large amount of camera trapping data held there, and looking at, okay, are camera traps being deployed in ways that are helping fill some of these data gaps that we see for GBIF data? And what's really exciting to me is that we see that it is potentially. So the map on the left is looking at the boost in data coverage that we get at the national level. And then I'm highlighting on the bottom there the 10 countries with the largest boosts in their data coverage when you add in camera trapping data on top of these other point occurrences coming from GBIF. And what's really exciting to see is that these are places that are typically very under-recognized and have huge data limitations. And then we can also see on the right, I'm highlighting at the species level, where a lot of the species that we see that are getting big boosts are sometimes elusive or smaller bodied organisms that aren't typically recognized. So I think, a lot of times camera traps get deployed to survey charismatic species, but they also collect data on everybody that comes by the camera. And I think that speaks to a huge power of technology to help us fill in some of these data gaps. So hopefully that paper will be coming out soon. Yeah, so I guess just to summarize, it was sort of span a lot of different spaces as a researcher. And the thing that I'm really excited about, as the ability to deploy these technologies has gotten so much easier, and we're seeing the huge advance of AI and translating that into observations that we can use. I think now we're really at a point where I feel like we need work on, okay, how do we translate that back into ecological insight, and how do we start bringing some of these data types together? So through my work, I think a lot of the things that I'm seeing come up are, the real need for data sharing and coordination across different data types, but then also like a huge amount of my work is just trying to develop scalable workflows that can help us go from, especially in animal movement, we're getting into millions or billions of observations, and we just don't really have the tools necessarily to process that. But yeah, and also just, a lot of these projects, I think, involve a lot of collaboration across, realms of ecology, meaning terrestrial or marine, but also people. And yeah, anyway, thank you so much for having me. Those are just some of the exciting work that I'm like trying to think about how to bring this constellation back together, and ways that we can do that in a way that informs as many questions as possible. So thanks so much.
That was awesome, Ruth. You're touching on so many and threading links between so many amazing projects. Ruth, Rob, do you want to jump in and ask your question of Ruth quickly?
Hi, Ruth. Yeah, just a very quick question about your camera trap data.
Yeah.
When you were talking about your percentages, because they all looked really low, and I was intrigued to see that Australia which is where I'm based, was really low. Is it just people who share their data with you, or is it anyone you could find that was doing camera trapping, say in like published studies or whatever?
Yeah, so I'm working just with the Wildlife Insights data, and Wildlife Insights has, we're trying to balance, and I think this is such a big question for many different communities. How do you balance data sharing with, concerns over data privacy and also data sovereignty, and how to make sure to support acknowledgement of the folks that, spent a ton of effort. So Wildlife Insights data sharing model currently is that folks are allowed to embargo data for a number of years. Obviously, you can also blur and remove species of sensitive nature. So this is all data that was publicly available through Wildlife Insights. And so there's actually a ton more that isn't publicly available yet because it's under embargo. So yeah, and because the platform is quite new, we're still at very early data volume, in terms of volume, but it's quite low. And I think there's, one pitch that we're hoping comes out of this paper is trying to encourage people to share, to see that, sharing your data could have a global impact beyond your local study. And if there's ways that we can empower people to do that in a way that still respects their needs, is something we're really excited about.